The boy was 16, and he could not make himself look at her. Rain ticked against the canvas of 14 wagons. Oxen stamped and steamed in the mud. Somewhere ahead, a man was shouting about schedule, about snow, about how many miles they could lose before the mountain closed the road for good. The boy stacked her things in a pile on the wet ground: flour sack, bean pouch, salt, a torn blanket, a dead man's tools. And he set each one down carefully the way a person handles belongings that are about to become all someone has left. When he finished, he stood for a moment with his hands open at his sides. Then he turned and walked after the wagons without a word. Behind him, a wagon captain opened a leather ledger and drew a single line through a name. The travel tally dropped by 1. The ink bled in the rain. Marit Breka had buried her husband 11 days before the axle broke. Oddman went into the ground near the Snake River with a fever that turned his skin the color of wet ash, and the wagon train did not stop moving for longer than it took to pile stones over the grave. She was 6 months carrying. She had 31 pounds of flour, 11 pounds of beans, a half sack of salt, 1 blanket, a canvas roll, her husband's small toolkit, and $6 in coin so worn the faces had nearly vanished. The cart was a 2-wheeled emigrant rig, not a proper wagon, light enough for 1 ox to pull, which was useful because the ox had died 4 days after Oddmund. She had been dragging the cart herself, hitched to it with a rope harness across her chest, for 70 miles. The train had already lost 2 oxen and a child to sickness before the Mount Hood Road. Nobody talked about the child. They talked about the mud. The Barlow Road cut through old-growth timber on the south flank of the mountain, and in late October of 1853, the rains had not stopped for 9 days. The track was not a road in any sense Marit recognized. It was a scar through fallen trees, stumps cut waist-high, roots jutting from black earth like broken fingers. The wagons ahead of her lurched and groaned. Men shouted at animals. Women walked beside the wheels, holding children above the muck that reached their shins. Marit could not keep pace. The rope harness cut into her collarbone, and the cart's iron-rimmed wheels sank 4 inches with every step. She fell twice on a descent near Barlow Creek. The second time, the left axle pin sheared clean. The wheel canted sideways. The cart box slammed into the mud, and 31 pounds of flour, 11 pounds of beans, and everything she owned in the world came to rest at an angle in the rain. She was on her knees in the track when Gideon Roke rode back. Roke was 51. Lean in the way men get lean when they have spent decades doing work that eats muscle instead of building it. He had captained 3 emigrant trains and cut road through timber twice for the Territorial Company. He carried a leather ledger in his coat and a reputation for decisions that kept people alive, even when the decisions were cruel. He did not dismount. He looked at the broken cart, then at Marit, then at the sky, which was the color of a bruise that would not heal. "How far along?" Roke asked. Marit told him. 6 months. "Can you walk without the cart?" She could walk, but everything she had was in the cart: the flour, the beans, the tools, the canvas, and folded inside the toolkit, wrapped in oilcloth, was Oddman's work contract, a signed agreement for labor at a mill near Oregon City, transferable to his wife in the event of death. Without that paper, she had no claim to shelter, no promise of wages, nothing waiting for her at the end of the trail except the open charity of strangers. Roke opened his ledger. He studied it the way a man studies a column of numbers that will not add up no matter how many times he runs them. The train was 31 souls, 14 wagons, and 9 working animals. They were behind schedule. Snow could close the high ground in 2 weeks or 5. Nobody knew. 3 to 5 miles a day through the worst of the timber, and that assumed no more breakdowns. "I cannot hold 30 people for 1 cart," Roke said. He said it the way a man says something he has said before, in other years, about other carts and other people left beside them. "One day," Marit said. "Give me 1 day to fix the pin." Roke looked at the axle. The pin had not bent. It had sheared. The iron was old, and the brake was clean, and there was no forge within 40 miles. He shook his head. "Half a day," he said. "I will send 2 men to help you unload what can be carried by hand. The rest stays." He rode forward. He did not look back, and as he rode, he opened the ledger one more time and drew a single line through the name Oddman Brecke. The travel tally now read 30 souls. Marit watched the ink dry in the rain. The 2 men Roke sent were not unkind. They worked fast. They pulled the flour sack and the bean pouch and the salt and the blanket from the cart box and piled them on a square of canvas in the mud. One of them, a boy of 16 named Derry, who drove a mule team, would not look at Marit directly. He stacked her things and kept his eyes on his hands. When he finished, he stood for a moment as if he wanted to say something. Then he turned and walked after the train. The other man was Asa Venn. Venn was 42, wide through the chest, with a packer's calloused hands and a speculator's careful eyes. He ran a mule strain and traded in goods that desperate people abandoned along the trail, flour sacks split by rain, tools dropped in river crossings, canvas torn from wrecked wagons. He bought cheap and sold dear and kept his accounts in his head, not in a ledger, because a ledger could be read by other people. He had been watching Marit for 3 days, the way a man watches a tree that is about to fall and leave something useful on the ground. "I can take the weight off your hands," Venn said. He crouched beside the pile. $2 for the lot, flour, beans, salt, canvas, tools. He paused. "The contract, too, if you want to be done with it." $2. Marit's flour alone, if dry, was worth $4 at the Dalles. The contract was worth a winter's wages. "No," she said. Venn did not stand. He stayed crouched, his hands resting on his knees, and he smiled the way a man smiles when he knows time is on his side. "Dead people do not need flour," he said. He said it quietly, almost gently, as if he were offering her a kindness she was too proud to accept. "And that child will not eat pride." "The child will eat beans," Marit said. "Get away from my things." Venn stood. He brushed mud from his knees. He shrugged. "I will be on the road," he said. "When you change your mind, find me. The price may be lower." He walked away, and Marit was alone. The wagon train moved. She could hear it for a long time, the creak of wood, the shouts of teamsters, the low complaint of oxen, the iron ring of wheels on stone. Then the sounds grew faint. Then they were gone. What replaced them was rain on leaves, rain on mud, rain on canvas, rain on the broken cart, and beneath all of it, the enormous silence of old-growth timber that had been standing since before anyone alive had drawn a first breath. Marit sat on the flour sack and pressed her hands against her belly. The child moved. She counted what she had: 31 pounds of flour, 11 pounds of beans, a half sack of salt, 1 blanket, damp, a canvas roll torn at one corner, Oddman's toolkit, a hand axe too light for felling, a draw knife, a rasp, a ball of twine, 4 iron nails, a leather punch, and an awl, $6 in coin, no animal, no husband, no relatives west of the Cascades, no money for pack transport, and a work contract that meant nothing if she froze to death beside the road. She could not go forward. The train was gone, and she could not walk fast enough to catch it, not dragging supplies, not pregnant, not through this mud. She could not go back. The nearest settlement behind her was 200 miles of trail she had already barely survived once. She could not stay where she was. The road was a drainage channel in rain, and in snow it would vanish entirely. The math was simple enough that a child could do it. Her food, rationed hard, might last 40 days. A night without shelter in the Mount Hood timber, with wet blankets and no fire, could kill her in one. She did not need 40 days of food. She needed one warm night repeated until spring. Roke had been right about one thing. A winter shelter in that country required tools she did not have, labor she could not perform, and time she had already spent. 6 cords of fuel and 3 men working 6 days. That was his estimate for a crude cabin, and he had built enough of them to know. Marit had a hand axe, a drawn knife, and a body that was growing heavier by the week. She sat in the rain until the light began to fail. Then, from the dark timber above the road, she heard a sound. Not thunder, not wind. A deep, slow crack, the sound of something enormous shifting under its own weight. Wood fibers separating, a groan that traveled through the ground into her knees. She did not sleep that night. She pulled the canvas over her body and the flour sack and lay in the mud beside the broken cart and listened to the forest move in the dark. Rain fell. The child kicked, and somewhere above her, something very large and very old was deciding whether to stand or fall. At first light, Marit followed the sound. She climbed through deadfall and fern, stepping over roots slick with rain. The slope above the road was steep and tangled. Old growth, the trunks so large that 2 people linking arms could not have circled the smallest of them. Bark hung in long strips. Moss grew on everything. The air smelled like wet earth and resin and rot, all at once, as if the forest were both alive and decomposing in the same breath. She found the pine 60 yards above the road. It was a western white pine, and it was enormous. The trunk was 5 feet through at the base, and it had fallen recently enough that the bark was still firm, and the needles still held green at the tips of the highest branches. 3 massive limbs had driven into the slope on the downhill side and caught, so the trunk hung suspended above the ground at an angle, high enough at the root end to stand beneath, tapering to the point where the crown had shattered against a boulder. The space beneath the trunk was narrow, irregular, and littered with bark scales and dead needles. It was also dry. Marit knelt and pressed her palm against the ground beneath the pine. No rain reached it. The trunk was a roof, and the dense bark and remaining limbs above it shed water outward. The ground was damp from moisture that had crept in sideways, but the soil directly beneath the widest part of the trunk was darker, firmer, and not puddled. She could feel the difference between this ground and the mud 20 feet away, the way she could feel the difference between a dry stone and a wet one. She did not think about insulation. She did not have a word for thermal mass. What she thought about was her mother. In the Brecka farmstead near Voss, the winters came early and stayed. The house was timber, old, chinked with moss and clay the way every house in the valley was chinked. Marit had grown up watching her mother maintain those walls. Every autumn, her mother pulled old moss from the seams, sorted it, and packed new moss in dry moss, pale and springy, gathered from logs and stone walls above the boggy ground. Her mother rejected dark, wet clumps with a squeeze and a flick of the wrist. The wall only keeps life if it stays dry, her mother said. Moss holds air. Air holds warmth, but only if the moss does not hold water instead. Marit had packed moss into timber seams since she was 9 years old. She knew the feel of dry sphagnum between her fingers, light, resistant, springing back when pressed. She knew the difference between moss gathered from a raised log and moss pulled from a standing bog. She had never thought of it as knowledge. She had thought of it as chores. Now she knelt beneath a fallen giant and thought, small room, dry seams, no wind. The idea arrived not as a flash, but as a sequence. Remove the cart box from the broken frame. Drag it uphill. Wedge it beneath the pine where the trunk was highest, turned on its side so the open top faced the bark above. Use the wheels and the broken axle as braces. Line the ground with bark slabs and boughs to raise the sleeping surface above moisture. Then pack every gap, every seam, every crack between cart and trunk and ground with dried moss, sphagnum and forest moss gathered from raised surfaces, never from boggy ground. Smear the outside with mud as a windskin, but keep the moss itself dry behind bark, and leave one vent. A thumb-thick hole made from a hollow elder stem, angled down under a bark lip so that snow could not plug it, but breath could escape. The design was not a cabin. It was not even a shelter in any way Gideon Roque would have recognized. It was a body-sized pocket of still air, wrapped in dry moss, wedged beneath a tree that was already stronger than any ridgepole she could cut. It could also kill her in 4 different ways. If the trunk shifted on its supports, it would crush anything beneath it. If the moss got wet, from rain seeping through gaps, from snow melt, from condensation, it would become dead weight pressing cold against her body instead of holding warmth. If she sealed the pod too tightly, her own breath would foul the air inside and she would suffocate in her sleep. And if she left it too open, wind would steal every degree of warmth her body produced, and she would freeze anyway. She stood under the pine for a long time. She pressed her hand against the trunk. The bark was rough and cold and solid. She could feel, very faintly, the tree's weight resting on those 3 buried limbs. They were thick as a man's waist. They did not move. She began to drag the cart box up the slope. It took Merritt most of the day to move the cart box 60 yards uphill. The box was 12 feet long and heavy with soaked wood. She could not lift it. She could not roll it. She levered it with a branch, dragged it a body length, braced it with stones, and levered it again. The rain did not stop. Her feet slipped on the slope, and she fell 3 times. The 3rd time, she lay in the mud for a full minute before she pushed herself up, because the child had kicked so hard it felt like a fist inside her ribs, and she needed to breathe. By late afternoon, the cart box was beneath the pine. She positioned it with the open top facing the trunk, tilted so the bottom edge rested on the ground, and the upper edge leaned against the bark. The fit was rough. Gaps showed everywhere. Between the box and the trunk, between the box and the ground, along the edges where warped planks had pulled apart during months of trail abuse. The box smelled like wet wood and old flour paste and the faint iron tang of Oddman's tools, which she had already moved into the cavity. She wedged the wheels on either side as braces, one jammed into a root hollow and one propped against a stone. The broken axle pin she drove into a crack in the trunk as an anchor. The frame held. The box did not slide. Then she began gathering moss. This was work she understood. She did not go to the creek bottom where moss grew thick and dark and waterlogged. She went to fallen logs on the upper slope where pale sphagnum grew in mats over bark that shed rain. She peeled it in sheets, squeezed each handful, and rejected anything that dripped. The dry moss went into her canvas, which she spread on the ground beneath the pine. The wet moss she left where it lay. By nightfall, she had a pile the size of a small haystack, but it was not enough. The gaps in the cart box were wide, and the space between box and trunk was uneven. She estimated she would need 4 or 5 times as much moss to pack the walls to any useful thickness. At the rate she was gathering, that was 3 days of work at least. And she had not yet addressed the ground, the entry, the bark shingles, or the vent. She slept that night inside the unpacked cart box, curled on boughs she had cut with the hand axe. The box blocked wind from two sides. The trunk blocked rain from above. But cold came through every gap, and by midnight her blanket was wet from condensation, and her teeth ached from clenching. She pressed her hands between her thighs and counted the child's movements and waited for light. The next morning, Anson Pike arrived. Pike was 36, built for the work of falling timber and driving ox teams, with hands large enough to palm a cant hook and a voice that carried through dense forest without effort. He led a mule stream through the timber with two other loggers, hauling split boards from a crude mill 4 miles east. They were not part of Roke's train. They worked the road itself, cutting, grading, clearing, and they knew the terrain better than any immigrant. Pike stopped when he saw the cart box under the pine. For a long moment he did not speak. He stood in the rain with his mules and looked at a pregnant woman kneeling beside a broken emigrant cart, wedged beneath a fallen tree, surrounded by piles of wet and dry moss, sorted on a canvas sheet. The picture did not match anything in his experience. "What are you doing?" Pike asked. "Building a shelter," Marit said. She did not stop sorting moss. Pike walked closer. He looked at the cart box, the trunk, the gaps, and the moss. He bent and picked up a handful of the dry sphagnum. He rubbed it between his fingers. He looked at Marit the way a man looks at someone who may have lost their mind, but has not yet done anything dangerous enough to intervene. "Moss," he said. "Dry moss," Marit said. "That is swamp sponge," Pike said. "You are corking a coffin." Marit stopped sorting. She looked up at him. "Does snow break branches first where the wind hits, or where it cannot reach?" Pike opened his mouth and then closed it. The question was not the kind of question a woman stuffing moss into a cart box was supposed to ask. It was a timber question. A man who had spent 10 years in old growth could answer it. But the answer was not simple, and the fact that she had asked it meant she already knew something about how weight and wind move through wood. "Where it cannot reach," Pike said slowly. "Snow piles on the lee side. Wind strips the windward branches clean. The weight collects where it is quiet." "That is why the cart faces this direction," Marit said. She pointed. The open end of the box, which would become the entry, faced the slope, away from the prevailing wind, tucked into the angle where the trunk met the ground. Snow driven by wind would pass over the top. Snow falling straight would land on the trunk, not the entry. Pike said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "You will freeze." "Perhaps," Marit said, "but I will freeze more slowly than if I slept in the open." "That is not a comfort." "It is not meant to be a comfort. It is meant to be a calculation." Pike looked at the sky, then at the forest, then at the mule string behind him. The loggers were waiting. He needed to move. He reached into a pannier and pulled out a short length of rawhide, cured and stiff, the kind used for lashing loads. He tossed it at Marit's feet. "For your coffin door," he said. He turned and led the mules down the slope. But Marit picked up the rawhide and felt its weight and its strength and knew it was exactly what she needed to lash the cart box against the root system of the pine. The rawhide was not charity, but it was not nothing. The gossip reached the road camp before Marit's third day of work was finished. Asaven told the story at the temporary camp 3 miles down the road, where teamsters and packers sheltered under canvas between trips. The pregnant widow, he said, the Norwegian, she had gone tree mad. She was stuffing a broken cart with bog trash under a dead pine and calling it a house. He told it with the careful amusement of a man who wants other people to laugh first so he can measure how far the mockery will carry. It carried far enough. Men stopped on the road to stare. 2 teamsters climbed the slope to look and came back shaking their heads. A woman from a small family train left a heel of bread on the road below the pine, but would not step closer. She crossed herself and whispered that no child should be born under dead wood. Asa sharpened the joke into a weapon. By first snow, he said, that pine will have 2 graves under it. The laughter was not cruel in the way Asa's private words were cruel. Most of the men on the road had seen desperate people do desperate things in the timber, and most of those things had ended badly. A pregnant woman alone was already a tragedy. A pregnant woman stuffing moss into a broken cart was a tragedy that did not know it was a tragedy yet. Pity and mockery lived in the same sentence when they talked about Marit Brecka. But Asaven was not laughing from pity. He was calculating. If Marit died or quit, her goods became salvage under the loose customs of the road. Flour, beans, tools, and a transferable work contract, together worth perhaps $20 to the right buyer at the Dalles or Oregon City. Asa had paid $2 for claims worth 10 times that. He had built his entire operation on the simple arithmetic of giving up. The confrontation happened on Marit's 4th morning. She had carried bark slabs from a fallen cedar to the pine and was laying them inside the cart box as a raised platform for bedding. The ground beneath the box was damp, and any sleeping surface needed to sit above the moisture line. She measured by hand spans, 4 inches of clearance between the bark platform and the mud. Asa came up the slope alone. He brought no mule and carried nothing except his coat and his careful eyes. He stood and watched Marit work for a full minute before speaking. $3, he said, for everything. Flour, beans, salt, tools, contract. $3, and I will arrange pack transport for you to the Dalles. You can find a family there. Someone will take you in. $3 was better than 2, which told Marit that Asa had done his own math and found the stakes worth raising. She did not stop laying bark. Nothing is for sale, she said. Asa stepped closer. The road has rules, he said. Abandoned property belongs to those who can move it. If you leave this site, if you walk away, even for one day, what is here becomes unclaimed. I am not leaving. Winter will make that choice for you. Marit straightened. Her back ached, and her hands were raw from bark, and her belly pressed against the waistband of her skirt. She looked at Asaven with the steady gaze of a woman who had buried a husband in a country she had never seen and dragged a cart 70 miles with a rope. Nothing is abandoned while I'm breathing beside it, she said. Asa studied her. He was not a fool. He knew the difference between stubbornness and conviction, and he was not yet certain which he was looking at. He nodded once, slowly, and walked back down the slope. That same afternoon, Gideon Roque passed through on his way west with the lead wagons. He did not climb the slope, but he sent word through a teamster. He would not defend Marit's plan, but he confirmed that Asa had no legal claim to occupied property on territorial road land. It was not support. It was a rule applied without affection, but it was enough to keep Asa from taking what Marit would not sell. Marit continued because the alternative was surrender, and surrender cost more than shame. She measured the shelter by body lengths, not by any formal plan. Enough space to lie curled on her side with the child in her belly. Enough room for the water crock and the flour tin and the bean pouch. Enough moss to cover her with a wall that wind could not blow away. On the 5th day, she packed the first full wall, the windward side, 8 inches thick, compressed between bark slabs that held the moss in place, while mud on the outer face stopped wind. The moss was dry. She had tested each handful the way her mother had tested it. Squeeze, watch, feel. If water dripped, it went back to the forest floor. If the moss sprang back, pale and airy, it went into the wall. That evening, she tested a candle inside the half-sealed cart box. She set it on the bark platform and closed the entry flap. A piece of canvas lashed across the opening with Anson Pike's rawhide. The flame burned steady. She watched it for a long time, looking for the bend that would tell her where the draft was. The flame leaned left toward a gap where the cart box met a root spur. She packed the gap with moss and bark and tested again. The flame held straight. The first sleet came that night. It turned the mud skin on the outside of the shelter glossy, like the shell of something living. Inside, Marit pressed her hand against the moss wall. One corner, low and close to the ground where the bark slab had shifted, was damp. She felt the dampness with her fingertips, and her stomach dropped. One wet seam could wick moisture through the entire wall. Everything her mother had taught her reduced to this. Dry moss holds air, wet moss holds cold, and the difference between them is the difference between waking up and not. She could not fix it in the dark. She curled on the bough bed and pulled the blanket tight and listened to sleet tick against the pine above her and counted the hours until she could see the damage. And beyond the shelter, beyond the pine, beyond the slope and the ruined road and the mud, the first real weather of winter was building in the north. Not sleet, not rain, something heavier. Tell us in the comments. Have you ever had someone mock a thing you were building because they could not yet understand it? The temperature had not dropped yet, but the air tasted different. Marit knew the taste. She had grown up with it in Voss, where it arrived 2 weeks before the first deep snow and settled into the valleys like something patient. She had perhaps 10 days, perhaps fewer. The shelter was half packed, the ground bed was rough, the entry flap leaked, the vent was not yet built, and one corner of the moss wall was already drinking water from a seam she had sealed wrong. 10 days to finish a thing that the strongest men on the road said could not be done. 10 days with a hand axe, a draw knife, and a body that was growing a child whether she rested or not. 10 days before the mountain decided whether Marit Breke had built a shelter or a grave. The sleet stopped sometime before dawn. In the silence that followed, she heard the pine trunk above her settle. A low wooden groan, the weight of the world shifting by a quarter inch. She held her breath. The trunk held. Somewhere in the dark, an owl called once and did not call again. Morning showed Marit what the dark had hidden. The damp corner ran 6 inches along the base of the windward wall, where a bark slab had slipped during the night. Water had wicked upward through the moss like ink through cloth. She pressed her fingers into it and felt the cold, not the cold of air, but the cold of wet fiber against skin pulling warmth away. 8 inches of moss she had spent a full day packing. She pulled it out. All of it. Every handful from the lower windward section came free in dark, heavy clumps that smelled like bog and felt like dead weight. She spread the ruined moss on a root and started again. The repair cost her half a day. She relaid the bark slab at a steeper angle, wedged a stone beneath its lower edge to keep it from sliding, and packed fresh dry moss behind it. This time she layered bark between the moss and the ground contact point so that moisture from below could not wick upward into the insulation. It was a guess. She did not know whether it would work. But her mother had never let wet moss touch timber without a barrier, and bark was the barrier the forest offered. She was kneeling in the mud outside the shelter, sorting another batch of sphagnum, when a mule appeared on the slope above her. The woman riding it was 58 years old, with hands that looked older than the rest of her. She had the build of someone who had spent decades working at elevations where the air thinned and the wind never fully stopped. Broad through the shoulders, heavy in the forearms, with a face the weather had scored into permanent lines. She wore a wool coat patched at both elbows and a hat that had lost all shape to rain. She sat the mule with the ease of a person who had stopped thinking about riding 40 years ago. Torbjörn Kvamme had come down from a pack station near Summit Meadows, because a teamster told her a woman was alone in the timber. Torbjörn was Norwegian, a widow, a midwife, and a former mountain dairy worker who had spent 6 summers at high pasture in the valleys near Hardanger before emigrating. She ran a seasonal camp with a small family that operated a pack station on the road, ferrying supplies over the rough stretch. She had delivered 11 babies in Oregon Territory. She had buried 3 of her own. She dismounted without greeting Marit. She walked past her, bent at the shelter entrance, and looked inside. She stayed there for a long time. Then she backed out, straightened, and looked at the moss spread on the canvas. She picked up a handful. She squeezed it. She brought it to her nose and smelled it. She dropped it and picked up another. She squeezed that one too, and this time she held it out to Marit. "You chose the right tree," Torbjörn said, "and the wrong moss." Marit looked at the handful. It was the same pale sphagnum she had been gathering for days, dry, springy, pulled from raised logs. "It springs back," Marit said. "It is dry." "It is dry now," Torbjörn said. "But you gathered it after the rain. The fibers swelled. They hold shape, but they have already opened. When the cold comes and moisture freezes inside the fiber, it will expand and the wall will crack at the seams." She dropped the moss. "You need moss that was dry before the rain and stayed dry, under bark cover, under overhangs, places the rain did not reach. There is not enough of that. Then you dry what you have." Torbjörn looked at the sky. "How far along?" 6 months, perhaps a week more." Torbjörn looked at the shelter again, then at the slope, then at the forest. She looked at Marit's hands, raw, cracked at the knuckles, stained dark with bark tannin. She looked at the careful way Marit held her back when she stood, the slight forward lean of pregnancy combined with the rigid posture of someone who could not afford to show pain. "Who taught you to chink moss?" Torbjörn asked. "My mother." "Where?" "Near Voss." Torbjörn nodded once. It was not a nod of sympathy. It was a nod of recognition, one woman from the Norwegian mountain country acknowledging another's inheritance. What Marit's mother had taught her was not a trick. It was a vocabulary, and Torbjörn could hear that Marit spoke it, even if she was conjugating some of the words wrong. "I will stay until the walls are finished," Torbjörn said. "Then I have a birth to attend at the road camp." She did not ask permission. She did not offer comfort. She tied her mule to a root spur and began pulling bark from a fallen cedar 30 feet down the slope. Torbjörn taught through hands, not lectures. The first lesson was dry selection. She made Marit spread every handful of gathered moss on a flat stone and wait. Moss that darkened within an hour had absorbed rain it had not yet released. Moss that stayed pale was safe. They sorted Marit's entire supply and discarded nearly a third of it. Then Torbjörn built a low fire, not a cooking fire, not a warming fire, but a drying rack. She strung canvas between 2 poles above the fire, out of spark range, and laid wet moss in thin layers. The smoke rose through the moss, and the heat pulled moisture without charring the fibers. "Never close enough to catch," Torbjörn said. "You are not cooking it. You are asking it to let go of the water." Marit watched the moss steam. She had been drying moss by spreading it in the open air, which worked only when the air itself was dry. In the Mount Hood timber, the air was never dry. Torbjörn's method used the fire's heat to force what the air would not give. "How long?" Marit asked. "Until it springs back when you squeeze it and your hand stays dry." Torbjörn pressed a test handful. Damp still. She put it back. "Patience is faster than repeating the wall." The second lesson was water shedding. The damp corner that had cost Marit half a day was not a moss failure. It was a bark failure. Water had run down the outside of the trunk, followed a groove in the bark, and dripped onto the mud skin directly above the seam where the cart box met the ground. The mud had channeled the water inside instead of shedding it. Torbjörg stripped long slabs of bark from the fallen cedar and laid them like shingles on the outside of the shelter, overlapping from top to bottom so that each slab shed water onto the one below it. The moss was never the outside layer. Bark took the drip. Mud stopped wind. Moss held still air. 3 layers, each with a single job. Your mother would have known this, Torbjörg said, but she had a roof above her walls. You do not. The trunk is your roof, but the trunk has channels. Water follows channels. Bark follows water. You lay bark where water wants to go, and you send it past the moss. The third lesson was ventilation. Marit had planned a thumb-thick vent from a hollow elder stem, and Torbjörg approved the concept, but not the execution. A single straight tube would clog with frost in the first hard freeze. Torbjörg cut a longer section of hollow elder, angled it downward through the wall at a slant, and capped the outer end with a small bark awning held by a sliver of bone. The slant meant that ice crystals forming at the cold outer end would slide outward under gravity instead of building inward. The bark awning kept snow from packing the opening. The inner end, warm from Marit's breath, would stay clear as long as the outer end drained. She made Marit test it with smoke from a bundle of damp needles. Marit held the smoldering bundle inside the sealed pod and watched the smoke find the vent and pull through it. The air inside cleared in 2 minutes. Warm is useless if breath turns poison, Torbjörg said. 1 vent is enough for 1 body. If you ever shelter 2, you cut a second. No argument. The 4th lesson was the one that might save Marit's life. Torbjörg took a piece of charcoal from the fire and made 3 marks on the pine trunk directly above the points where the support limbs entered the ground. Then she drove a stone into the earth below each mark, aligned precisely. The stone was the fixed reference. The charcoal mark was the moving indicator. If the trunk shifted, if the support limbs weakened under snow load, or if water undermined the soil beneath them, the charcoal marks would drift away from the stones. You check these every morning, Torbjörg said. If the marks move even the width of your thumb, you take the food, the blanket, and the child in your belly, and you leave. You do not pack the moss. You do not save the cart. You leave. How much time would I have? A tree this size, on this slope, with these supports? Torbjörg looked at the 3 limbs buried in the earth. If it starts to move, you have the time it takes to crawl out. Maybe less. Marit checked the marks 3 times that day. Progress accumulated in small, measurable increments, each one a victory against a deadline that did not negotiate. By the 2nd day of Torbjörg's help, the cart box was fully wedged beneath the trunk, braced by wheels and axle pin in stone with rawhide lashings at 4 points. By the 4th day, the ground bed was complete. Bark slabs raised 4 inches above the mud on a frame of stacked branches with a woven layer of fir boughs on top for insulation from below. By the 6th day, 2 full walls were packed 8 inches thick with dried moss, compressed between bark shingles on the outside and smooth bark on the inside. The moss was pale and dry and springy. Marit tested it every morning. It held. By the 8th day, the entry flap closed. Torbjörg had fashioned it from Marit's canvas, doubled over for thickness, with a rawhide hinge at the top, and a bark stiffener along the bottom edge that pressed against the ground when closed to block drafts. The entry was low enough that Marit had to crawl, which she resented until Torbjörg pointed out that heat rises and a low entry kept warm air inside. By the 9th day, only the rear seam remained. A narrow gap where the cart box did not quite meet the trunk's curve, roughly 2 inches wide and 18 inches long. Marit packed it with the driest moss she had, wedged bark on both sides, and sealed the outer face with mud mixed with cedar fiber. The physical cost was visible in everything Marit did. Her hands had cracked along every knuckle, and the cracks had darkened with bark stain and dried blood. Her lower back seized when she bent forward, and released only when she stood and pressed her fists against the muscles. She vomited twice on the 6th day after lifting a bark slab that was heavier than she had judged, and Torbjörg forced her to sit against the trunk and drink water and eat a fistful of flour mixed with salt. "You are feeding too," Torbjörg said. "If you collapse, you do not get up again." "I cannot stop. The rear seam." "We'll be there in an hour. Sit." Marit sat. She hated it. The child kicked against her ribs as if it, too, objected to stillness. But she sat because Torbjörg was right, and because the darkness at the edges of her vision after lifting the bark slab had frightened her more than she wanted to admit. Torbjörg made her stop twice every day after that. Marit resented it. Torbjörg did not care about resentment. Setback. On the 7th night, a raccoon found the bean sack. It chewed through the cloth and scattered beans across the mud. Marit recovered what she could by candlelight, picking beans from the dirt and rinsing them in the water crock. She lost perhaps 2 pounds. At her ration, a small handful boiled to mush each day. 2 pounds was 5 days of food. Setback. On the 8th day, rain ran down the trunk along a new channel Torbjörg had not anticipated. It soaked the upper section of the windward wall, the section Marit had repacked after the first failure. Water had found a path between 2 bark shingles, where they overlapped poorly. Torbjörg made Marit tear out the entire section. A full day's work. Gone. They repacked it with fresh dried moss and relaid the bark shingles with tighter overlap and a lip of mud along each seam. "Every wall you build twice is stronger than one you build once," Torbjörg said. "That is a comfort for people with time," Marit said. "It is not a comfort. It is an observation." They looked at each other in the rain. Torbjörg almost smiled. It was the closest they had come to understanding each other without the formality of instruction. Setback. Asa Venn stole the spare canvas strip. Marit had kept it folded beneath the cart box as a backup for the entry flap. One morning, it was gone. She found a drag mark in the mud leading down the slope toward the road. She followed it to the packers' camp and found the canvas strip folded beneath Asa's pack cover, used as extra waterproofing for his trade goods. Marit did not confront him. She waited until his mule was being watered at the creek, walked to the pack, and cut the strip free with Oddman's draw knife. She carried it back up the slope and said nothing to anyone. When Asa noticed the strip was gone, he looked up toward the pine. Marit was packing moss. She did not look down. On the 9th day, Anson Pike returned. He came up the slope carrying 2 split shakeboards under one arm, each roughly 3 feet long and 8 inches wide, riven from a cedar stump. He set them against the pine trunk without ceremony. "Scrap," he said. "Mill can't use them. Edges are wrong." The edges were not wrong. The boards were cleanly split, straight-grained, and dry. They were exactly the right size to reinforce the bark shingles over the entry and the vent. Marit looked at the boards and then at Pike. "Thank you," she said. Nothing more. Pike nodded. He glanced at the shelter, at the moss walls, the bark shingles, the mud skin, the careful layering that had taken 9 days of labor. He did not call it a coffin. He did not call it anything. He looked at it for a long time, and then he looked at Torbjörg, who was sorting moss by the fire. "You are helping her," Pike said. "I'm helping myself to her fire," Torbjörg said. "She is helping herself." Pike left, but he walked more slowly down the slope than he had walked up. The pod was complete on the 10th day, and it looked like nothing any person would choose to live inside. From the outside, a broken emigrant cart box wedged beneath a fallen giant pine, caked with mud and bark and rawhide lashings, bristling with cedar shingles at odd angles, sealed with a canvas flap stiffened by a plank, and marked only by a thin elder stem vent protruding from the upper wall at a downward angle. It looked like wreckage. It looked like someone had tried to hide salvage under a deadfall and given up partway through. From the inside, a body-sized chamber, 6 feet 4 inches long, 32 inches wide at the shoulder, 28 inches high at the deepest point. A raised bough bed on bark slabs 4 inches above the mud. A water crock wedged beside the bed, sealed with a bark lid. A flour tin. A bean pouch. A tallow cup with a wick for light and a small amount of warmth. The vent angled through the wall. And on every surface, above, beside, beneath, 8 to 10 inches of dry moss on the windward side, 4 to 6 inches on the lee, all held in place by bark and sealed against wind by the outer mud skin. Early tests were promising, but did not convince the skeptics. On the first cold night after completion, frost formed on the outside bark shingles while the inner moss stayed dry. Marit's breath warmed the chamber enough that the water crock developed only a thin skin of ice at the mouth, not frozen solid through. Torbjörn showed her how to read the condensation. Frost near the vent opening was acceptable, proof that warm, moist air was moving outward. Wet dripping above the bedding was danger, proof that warm air was condensing against a cold surface and returning moisture to the space. The first night showed frost at the vent. No dripping above the bed. The system worked as designed. Gideon Roke returned from a scouting trip to the west. He had been assessing the road ahead for the territorial company, and he stopped at the pine because he had heard the stories and because he did not believe them. He crawled halfway into the shelter, his shoulders too wide for the entry, and stayed there for a full minute with his head and arms inside the pod. Then he backed out and stood and looked at Marit. "The space is too small to live in for a winter," he said. He was not wrong. The chamber was barely larger than a coffin. A person could not sit upright in it. A person could not stretch fully. A person could not cook, stand, or move without pressing against moss walls that had taken 10 days to build. It was not a home. It was not a cabin. It was not even a shelter in any way Roke's experience recognized. "I do not need a house," Marit said. "I need a night to become a morning," repeated until spring. Roke looked at the charcoal marks on the trunk, aligned with the stones below. He understood them immediately. He was a road builder. He knew about reference marks and shifting loads. He said nothing about them, but Marit saw him check the alignment before he left, and she saw his face when the marks held true. Asa Venn was not moved by early results. He stood on the road below the pine and told anyone who would listen that the first heavy snow would slide under the trunk and pack the entrance shut. He said wet snow was heavier than dry, and that the old bark would crack and let water through, and the whole thing would collapse inward like a rotten tooth. He said it with the steady conviction of a man who needed it to be true because his livelihood depended on other people's failure. Anson Pike heard Asa's prediction. He climbed the slope and studied the overhanging limbs, the 3 supports that held the trunk above the ground. He looked at the angle of the entry, the bark shingles, the drainage channels Torbjörn had cut in the mud. He said nothing. He did not agree with Asa. He did not disagree. He simply looked, and then he left. That evening, Torbjörn packed her mule. There was a birth to attend at the road camp 4 miles east, a woman 3 weeks from term whose husband had been injured in a log fall. Torbjörn could not stay. Before she left, she gave Marit a bone-handled awl. It was old, and the handle was smooth from decades of use. The steel was still sharp. If the vent freezes, you open it before you pray, Torbjörg said. She mounted her mule. She looked at the shelter one more time. She looked at Marit. You know more than you think, she said. That is dangerous. Learn what you do not know before it teaches you itself. She rode down the slope and into the timber. The sound of the mule's hooves faded, and Marit was alone again, inside a shelter that had not yet been tested by anything worse than frost. The storm did not announce itself. It arrived. Marit woke because the world had gone wrong, not louder, quieter. The rain that had been the constant voice of the forest for weeks had stopped, and what replaced it was a silence so total that she could hear her own blood moving in her ears. Then, from above the silence, the wind came. It came from the north, and it came all at once, not building, but arriving, as if something enormous had shifted position in the sky and sent the air ahead of it as a warning. The pine above her groaned. Not the small, settling sound she had grown used to, a deep, continuous sound, wood fibers flexing under pressure that had not been there a moment before. The trunk was a sounding board, and the wind was playing it. Then the snow. Not the soft, vertical snow of early winter. Wet, dense, wind-driven snow that hit the bark shingles with the sound of thrown sand. Marit could hear it packing against the windward side of the shelter, not accumulating gently, but being forced into every crack and seam and edge by wind that did not pause. Within minutes, the sound changed. The individual impacts merged into a continuous hiss, like water pouring over gravel, as snow built on the trunk and the bark and the mud skin above her. She lit the tallow cup. The flame was small and steady, which meant the vent was still drawing. She watched it. If the flame died or wavered toward the vent, it meant the airflow had reversed. Outside pressure pushing in instead of inside warmth pulling out. The flame held. The first complication came within the hour. The vent began to clog. Marit heard the change before she saw it. The faint whistle of air through the elder stem grew higher in pitch, which meant the opening was narrowing. Ice crystals driven by wind were packing the outer end of the tube. Torbjörg's angled design was shedding some of the crystals, but the wind was strong enough to force them past the bark awning and into the stem. Marit crawled to the vent end of the chamber. She could feel the change in air. The vent was still open. She could feel faint cold on her fingers near the inner opening, but the flow had slowed. She took Torbjörg's bone-handled awl and fed it into the stem, gently, turning it to break the ice that was building inside. She felt the resistance, then the give, then the sudden rush of cold air as the plug broke free. Crystals of ice sprayed against her hand. Cold knifed in through the cleared vent. The temperature inside the pod dropped immediately. She could feel it on her face, on her exposed hand, in the sudden sharpening of the air she breathed. She had to choose. A clogged vent meant warm air but poisoned breath. A clear vent meant safe air but brutal cold. The choice would repeat all night. She cleared the vent and let the cold come. She pulled the blanket tighter and pressed her back against the moss wall and felt the wall hold. The moss was dry. The bark shingles outside were taking the wind. The mud skin was cracking under the cold, but the cracks were shallow and the moss beneath was unbroken. The system was performing as designed, but the system was performing at the edge of what Marit could physically endure. The second complication arrived without warning. Pain folded her in the dark. Not the dull ache of labor she had been warned about, but a sharp, tightening cramp that seized her abdomen and held. She curled around it, pressing her hands against her belly, and counted. The cramp lasted perhaps 30 seconds, then released. She breathed. The child moved. Another cramp 5 minutes later, shorter but sharper. She did not know whether this was labor. She was 6 months along, perhaps 7. She had lost count of the weeks in the mud and the timber, and she had no one to ask. Torbjörn was 4 miles away at the road camp. There was no one else within the sound of a voice. If the child was coming, it was coming now, in this space, in this storm, with no light except a tallow wick and no help except her own hands. She counted contractions. 3 in 20 minutes, then nothing for an hour. Then one more, mild, almost gentle, like the child was testing the walls of its own small room. Then nothing again. False labor. Practice. The body rehearsing something it would perform later. But Marit did not know that. She lay in the dark with her hands on her belly and her breath coming fast and waited for the next pain and the next and the next. Each time the cramp came, she forgot the storm. Each time it passed, the storm was louder than before. Sometime after midnight, someone shouted outside. Marit heard it through the wind, distorted, broken into syllables by gusts that ripped words apart before they could reach her. A man's voice. Then a child's voice, thinner, higher, swallowed by snow. She crawled to the entry flap and pushed it open. Cold hit her face like a hand. Snow was falling so thickly that she could not see 3 feet beyond the entry. Wind drove it sideways through the trees, but in the narrow cone of light from her tallow cup, she saw movement, a shape coming up the slope, bent forward against the wind, carrying something. Anson Pike stumbled into the light. He was coated in snow from his hat to his boots, and he was carrying a boy, 8 or 9 years old, limp, with bare feet that were white and rigid. The boy's lean-to at the road camp had collapsed under wet snow. Pike had found him under the canvas, already shaking, unable to walk. He had carried the boy uphill through the storm because the pine was the only shelter left standing in the timber. "I need the space," Pike said. His voice was hoarse and his face was raw. "Not for me, for the boy." Marit looked at the shelter. It was built for one body. The sleeping platform was sized for her to lie curled on her side. There was no room for 2 adults and a child. There was barely room for 1 woman and the child she carried inside her. "Send him in," Marit said. Pike pushed the boy through the entry. Marit caught him and pulled him onto the bough bed. His feet were the worst. White at the toes, waxy at the heels, cold to the touch in a way that went past cold into something she did not have a word for. She wrapped his feet in the blanket and pulled him against her body, curving around him the way she would curve around her own child. The boy's teeth chattered so hard she could hear them over the wind. The pod was now holding 2 bodies and the warmth of a tallow flame. The air volume was tiny, perhaps 30 cubic feet. 2 people breathing in 30 cubic feet with a single thumb-thick vent. "The vent," Marit said to Pike, who was crouching outside the entry, snow accumulating on his shoulders. "I need it clear. If it freezes while 2 of us breathe in here, we will not wake up." Pike understood. He positioned himself at the outer end of the vent, sheltered partially by the trunk but exposed to the full wind. He cleared the vent tube every time the whistle rose in pitch. He used his knife, then a stick, then his fingers when the knife slipped. He stayed there for hours. He did not complain. He did not ask to come inside. If you are invested in this story, stay with us, because the next few minutes decide whether her strange little shelter is refuge or trap. Inside the pod, Marit worked. She rubbed the boy's feet until color crept back into the skin, not warmth yet, but the faint pink of blood returning to tissue that had nearly given up. She fed him bean water from the crock, spoonful by spoonful, and told him to breathe slowly through his nose because each exhale added moisture to the air, and the moss walls would absorb what the vent did not carry out. She felt the air in the chamber change, grow thicker, warmer, closer, as two bodies heated a space that one body had barely warmed. The tallow cup flickered once when the vent clogged and the flame bent. She called to Pike. He cleared it. The flames straightened. The child pressed his face against her shoulder and shook, and then, slowly, stopped shaking. Outside the shelter, the storm dismantled everything that was not built to resist it. Asa Ven's storage tarp tore loose from its stakes and sailed into the dark. His flour, the flour he had bought from 3 abandoned wagons, soaked through in its sacks and began to freeze in misshapen lumps. A mule broke its picket line and vanished into the timber. At the road camp, a man who had refused to leave his canvas lean-to was found at dawn with blackened fingers and no boots, alive but barely, his extremities already dying. He would lose 4 toes and a thumb before spring. The pine held. Snow piled on the trunk, 4 feet by Pike's estimate, heavier on the lee side where wind deposited it in a massive drift. Branches snapped elsewhere in the forest, reports like gunfire echoing through the timber. Each time Marit heard one, she looked at the charcoal marks above the support limbs. She could see them in the flickering tallow light, 3 dark marks on pale bark, aligned with the stones below. They did not shift. The trunk had been holding its own weight for decades. 4 feet of snow was pressure, but it was pressure on a structure that had been engineered by time and gravity long before Marit crawled beneath it. The worst moment came on the 3rd night. The entrance tunnel packed shut. Wind-driven snow filled the space between the canvas flap and the outer wall, compressing into a solid mass that Marit could not push open from inside. She pressed both hands against the flap. It did not move. She pushed with her shoulder. Nothing. The canvas was backed by a foot of dense, wet snow, packed as tight as mortar. She could not reach Pike. She could not shout loudly enough to be heard through the snow. The vent was still clear. She could feel air moving through it, but the vent was thumb-thick. It was designed to exchange breath, not to provide the full air supply 2 people needed indefinitely. The tallow cup guttered. The flame shrank. The boy stirred against her. Marit found the broken axle pin in the toolkit. It was 6 inches of iron, sheared at one end to a rough edge. She braced herself against the bough bed and drove the pin into the snow that packed the entrance, aiming upward toward where she knew the sky would be. The snow resisted. She hit it again and again. Chips of compacted snow fell on her hands and into the pod. She worked the pin back and forth, widening the hole, driving it deeper. Blue light, faint gray, filtered through feet of overcast, but light. She had reached the surface. Cold air poured through the fist-sized hole, and the tallow flame jumped and steadied. She blocked most of the opening with a bark slab, leaving a slit, and packed loose moss around the edges. Not elegant, not permanent, but breathing. The storm lasted 3 days. When it ended, the silence was different from the silence that had preceded it. It was the silence of a world that had been rearranged. Trees that had stood for a century leaned at new angles. The road had disappeared under drifts. The creek was a white line between white banks. Nothing moved except smoke from distant fires and the slow, indifferent drip of melt from branches that had held. Pike dug out the entrance from the outside. He had sheltered in a hollow he carved into the drift against the trunk, wrapped in a horse blanket he had carried from the road camp. His face was raw, and his hands were cracked, but he was alive, and he was standing. He pulled snow from the tunnel until the canvas flap was free. Marit pushed it open from inside. She crawled out into a world made of white. The boy came after her, blinking, walking on feet that were swollen but not frozen. He had all his toes. He had all his fingers. He was hungry and disoriented, and he clung to Marit's coat with one hand as if letting go would send him back into the dark. Pike had left a tin cup outside the shelter 3 days ago, filled with water as a crude thermometer. It was frozen solid, a column of ice that had cracked the cup. Inside the pod, Marit's water crock had only a rim of ice at the mouth. The water beneath it was liquid. 3 days of blizzard, 3 nights of cold that froze metal cups solid, and the body-sized chamber under the pine had held enough warmth to keep water from freezing and a boy's feet from dying. Marit stood in the snow and looked at the shelter from outside. The mudskin was cracked, bark shingles had shifted, the snow drift on the lee side rose above the trunk, but the cart box had not moved. The moss walls had not collapsed. The vent, scarred with ice and awl marks, was still open. She turned and saw Gideon Roke standing 20 feet away, his boots deep in fresh snow, staring at the uncrushed cart box under 4 feet of white. He did not speak. He did not need to. His face said everything his ledger could not record, that his experience had drawn a line through a woman's name, and the woman had refused to be subtracted. Gideon Roke did not praise Marit first. He measured. He walked the perimeter of the fallen pine, checking the 3 support limbs, pressing his boot against each one to test for give. He crouched at the entrance and looked at the bark shingles, the mud skin, the drainage channels Torbjörg had cut. He crawled partway in and ran his hand along the moss wall, pressing with his fingertips the way a man presses a beam to feel for rot. He backed out. He looked at the snowdrift on the lee side, 4 feet of compacted white that had accumulated against the trunk without collapsing the structure beneath it. He looked at the vent, still open, scarred with ice and the marks of Torbjörg's awl. Then he turned to Anson Pike and Asa Venn, who were standing on the slope below, and he said the thing that cost him more than any entry in his ledger. A cabin would have failed here if the roof was wrong. This roof was already stronger than anything we could cut. Asa opened his mouth. Roke kept talking. I counted cords of wood, he said. I counted men and days and axes. I drew a line through her name because she could not build what I knew how to build, but she was not building what I knew. She was building something I had never measured. The words hung in the cold air. Pike said nothing. Asa closed his mouth and looked at the snow on his boots. Roke turned back to Marit, who was standing beside the pine with the boy's mother gripping her arm. The boy's mother had come up the slope at first light, running through snow that reached her knees, shouting her son's name. She found him standing beside Marit, wrapped in the blanket, eating flour paste from a tin cup. The woman dropped to her knees in the snow and pulled the boy against her and stayed there for a long time, rocking, saying his name, Thomas, 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 as if repetition could undo the 3 days she had spent believing he was dead. When she stood, she looked at Marit with the expression of a person who has been given back something they had already grieved. She did not thank her in words. She reached into her coat and pulled out a repaired wool stocking, hand-knitted, darned at the heel with darker thread. She pressed it into Marit's hand. His toes are there because of you, she said, because of that ugly cart under the pine. She took the boy and walked down the slope. Marit held the stocking. It was warm from the woman's body. She put it on her left foot, which had been wrapped in canvas for 11 days, and for the first time since the storm she felt something that was not cold and not pain and not fear. The validation did not come in a single moment. It came in visits. The first was a teamster named Collis, who drove supply wagons between the road camps. He had seen the lean-to collapses during the storm, and he had a practical question. Could the method work under a wagon box turned on its side? Marit told him it could, but only if the wagon box was braced against something that would not shift: a rock shelf, a stump, a standing tree with roots deep enough to hold. She made him walk the slope and identify 3 positions where a wagon box could be anchored. She rejected 2 because the ground was too soft and the drainage ran toward the shelter site instead of away from it. The 3rd she approved, and she showed him where to cut bark shingles and where to gather dry moss from raised logs. The 2nd visitor was a woman named Ruth, traveling with a family of 5. She had lost their tent to wind and wanted to know how thick the moss needed to be. Marit told her 8 inches on the side where wind hits, 4 on the sheltered side. But the number meant nothing without the method. She made Ruth squeeze moss until Ruth could tell the difference between dry and damp by feel alone. She made her lay bark shingles overlapping from top to bottom. She made her cut a vent and test it with smoke. "Do not guess the thickness," Marit said. "Measure it against your hand. 4 fingers wide is not enough. A full span, thumb to smallest finger on the wind side. And if you cannot keep it dry, do not pack it at all. Wet moss is worse than no moss." The 3rd visitor was Anson Pike. He did not come with a question. He came with a plank, a split cedar board 3 feet long, sanded smooth on one face. He set it against the pine and stood back and looked at the shelter the way he had looked at it before the storm. Except this time his face carried something different. Not admiration. Recognition. The expression of a man who has worked with wood his entire life and has just seen wood used in a way he did not imagine. "I called it a coffin," Pike said. "You did," Marit said. "I was wrong." "You were." He waited, as if expecting her to say more, to forgive him, to explain, to perform the social ritual of accepting an apology. Marit did not. She picked up the plank and examined its grain. It was good cedar, straight. She could use it to reinforce the entry frame, which had cracked during the storm when Pike dug through the packed snow. "This is good wood," she said. "It is," Pike said. They stood in silence for a moment, and the silence was not empty. It was the silence of 2 people who had been on opposite sides of something and were now standing on the same ground, looking at the same tree, and neither needed to say what had changed, because the tree and the storm and the boy's living feet had said it already. Pike began visiting the shelter every few days. He brought scraps, a hinge pin, a length of cord, a bark bucket he had made and decided was ugly. He did not announce himself as a helper. He simply arrived, set something down, and watched Marit work. Sometimes he asked questions. How did she know which moss to reject? How did the bark shingles stay in place during wind? Why did the vent angle downward instead of straight? He listened to the answers the way a man listens when he has decided the person speaking knows something he does not. Marit answered without teaching. She showed him the moss and let him squeeze it. She pointed at the bark and let him see the overlap. She did not explain the vent. She lit a smoldering bundle inside the pod and let him watch the smoke find its way out. He understood. He was a man who worked with his hands, and his hands learned faster than his pride. Asa Ven did not visit. Asa Ven had a different problem. His flour was ruined. The sacks he had stockpiled from abandoned wagons, the flour he had bought for pennies from desperate people and stored under a canvas tarp, had soaked through during the storm and then frozen. When the freeze broke, the flour thawed into paste and then began to rot. The smell reached the road camp within days. Asa hauled the sacks to the creek and dumped them, but the damage was already visible, half his trade inventory gone. The flour he had tried to buy from Marit for $2 was still dry in its tin inside the moss-walled pod. The irony was not lost on anyone. Asa's response was not humility, it was reframing. He told the men at the road camp that Marit had copied a known trapper trick. Packing moss under fallen timber was common practice, he said, in the northern mountains where he had worked as a young man. He claimed he had warned people to store goods under timber before the storm. He said the pregnant widow had simply listened and done what experienced men already knew. Anson Pike was standing at the campfire when Asa said this. Pike set down his tin cup and looked at Asa the way a man looks at a knot in a board that he has just split clean through. "You called it a corpse drawer," Pike said. "I was there. You said the pine would have 2 graves under it by first snow." He paused. "First snow came. The graves are empty. Your flower is in the creek." Asa did not reply. He picked up his pack and walked to his mule string and began checking harness that did not need checking. The men at the fire watched him go. Nobody defended him. Nobody needed to attack him further. The creek full of ruined flour said everything the road camp needed to hear. Torbjör returned on the 5th day after the storm, riding her mule through knee-deep snow with a wool scarf wrapped around her face and her hands red and cracked from cold. She had delivered the baby at the road camp, a boy, alive, healthy, and she had waited 2 days for the trail to become passable before riding back. She dismounted at the pine and looked at the shelter. She looked at the vent, scarred with awl marks. She looked at the bark slab blocking the fist-sized emergency hole Marit had punched through the packed entrance. She looked at the snowdrift on the lee side, still 4 feet deep, frozen solid. She did not hug Marit. She did not say she was proud. She crawled inside the pod and sat in the small, dark space and put her hand on the moss wall and pressed it, testing for damp. Dry. She checked the bough bed, intact. She checked the water crock, liquid. She checked the vent from inside, feeling the faint pull of air. Clear. Then she backed out and looked at Marit and said, "Tell me what happened." Marit told her. The vent clogging, the false labor, Pike and the boy. The entrance packing shut, the axle pin, the fist-sized hole, the 3 days of wind. Torbjör listened without interrupting. She asked no questions until Marit finished. Then she asked one. "The contractions. How many? How far apart?" Marit told her. 3 in 20 minutes, then nothing, then one more after an hour, then nothing again. Torbjör nodded. "Practice," she said. "The body rehearses. You have time, but not as much as you think." She looked at Marit's belly, which had grown visibly in the weeks since they had met. 2 months, perhaps less. The child is large. "Will you be here?" Torbjörg did not answer immediately. She looked at the forest, at the snow, at the road that wound through timber she had traveled for 6 years. She looked old in a way she had not looked old before the storm. The ride through the snow had cost her something she was not sure she could replace. "I will try," she said. That was not a promise. Marit heard what it was not, and the sound of a missing promise was louder than the storm had been. The days after the storm became a collaboration. Torbjör stayed at the pine for 2 weeks, sleeping beside the fire under a canvas lean-to that Marit helped her build. They worked together in a way that was different from the instruction of the first days. Torbjör no longer corrected from above. She suggested from alongside. And Marit, who had survived 3 nights alone in the pod with a freezing boy and a clogged vent, pushed back. The disagreement came over the second vent. Torbjör insisted on cutting a second ventilation hole in the pod, a backup positioned on the opposite wall, angled downward like the first. Her reasoning was sound. 2 people had sheltered in the pod during the storm. If 2 people ever used it again, 1 vent was not enough. The first vent had nearly killed them. Marit resisted. A second vent meant a second hole in the moss wall. A second hole was a second point of failure, a place where water could enter, where wind could find a path, where the careful balance of insulation and airflow could be disrupted. She had nearly died because of one vent. She did not want two ways to die. You nearly died because the one vent clogged, Torbjörg said. If you had two, you could close one and clear the other. If I had two, I would have two holes freezing shut in a storm. Then you angle them in different directions. The wind cannot come from everywhere at once. They argued about it for half a day, standing beside the pine in melting snow, their breath visible in the cold air. It was not a gentle disagreement. Torbjörg's voice sharpened when Marit dismissed the redundancy, and Marit's jaw set when Torbjörg insisted she was thinking like a woman who had survived one storm instead of a woman who needed to survive 10. One storm teaches you what works, Torbjörg said. It does not teach you what breaks next time. Marit looked at the pod. She looked at the vent, still scarred, still working. She looked at the moss wall on the opposite side, 4 inches thick on the lee, which was thinner than the windward wall, but had held through 3 days of blizzard without a single damp spot. If I cut a second vent, she said, I reinforce the wall around it to 8 inches, and I angle it south, away from the prevailing wind, and I put a bark plug inside that can be sealed from within. Torbjörg studied her. The correction was good. The specifications were sound. The fact that Marit had argued and then improved the design instead of simply obeying was more important than the vent itself. Good, Torbjörg said. You were listening. They cut the second vent together. Torbjörg held the bark while Marit packed the moss. When it was done, Marit tested both vents with smoke simultaneously and watched the air divide itself between them and pull out cleanly. The collaborative work continued. They built a shallow drainage trench lined with stones around the base of the shelter, channeling snowmelt away from the walls. They added a removable bark plug for the primary vent, a cylinder of bark wrapped in dry moss that could be inserted from inside to seal the vent temporarily during the worst wind. They wove a willow grate and laid it under the bough bedding to create an air gap between the sleeping surface and the bark platform, reducing moisture transfer from below. And they tied a tall pole to the entrance, extending 6 feet above the snow line, wrapped with a strip of red-dyed cloth that Torbjörg had torn from her own scarf. So rescuers can find it after drifts, Torbjörg said, and so you can find it yourself if you step out and the snow swallows the entrance behind you. These were not improvements born from theory. They were corrections demanded by the storm. Every modification answered a specific failure or near failure that the blizzard had revealed. The drainage trench answered the meltwater that would come in spring. The bark plug answered the heat loss from vent clearing. The willow grate answered the dampness that crept upward from the ground during long occupation. The marker pole answered the terror of the packed entrance. Marit was building something more than a shelter now. She was building a set of rules. Torbjörg left on a gray morning when the clouds sat so low they tangled in the treetops. She had a berth to attend 3 days' ride south, and her mule was old, and the trail was bad, and she could not delay. But this departure felt different from the first. The first time Torbjörg had left a student. This time she was leaving a colleague, and the difference was visible in the way she stood at the mule's shoulder and looked at the pine as if memorizing it. She gave Marit her old birthing cord, a length of twisted sinew, cleaned and oiled, used for tying and cutting. It was not a medical instrument in any formal sense. It was a piece of a midwife's life, handed from one pair of hands to another. You know enough now to be argued with, Torbjörg said. It was the highest compliment she had given anyone. Marit understood it. To be argued with meant to have a position worth challenging. It meant standing on ground firm enough to push back from. It meant Torbjörn trusted Marit's judgment enough to disagree with it, which was a deeper trust than agreement. Torbjörg mounted her mule. She did not look back. The sound of hooves in snow grew faint, and then was gone, and Marit stood beside the pine with the birthing cord in her hand, and the second vent drawing smoke and the marker pole red against the gray sky. She went inside the pod and lay on the bough bed and pressed her hands against her belly and felt the child move. The space was small and dark and warm. The moss walls smelled like earth and resin and smoke. The vent whispered. There is a kind of silence that is not empty but full, full of everything that has been said and done in a place, soaked into the walls like warmth into moss. The pod held Torbjörn's voice. It held Pike's rawhide. It held the boy's shivering and his mother's stalking and the sound of an awl punching through ice. It held everything Marit had carried from Voss to the Snake River, to the mud of the Barlow Road. It held what she had lost and what she was building and what she could not yet see. She did not cry. She closed her eyes and listened to the vent breathe and waited for the child to kick. The secondary crisis came from imitation. 2 weeks after the storm, 3 men from a late-arriving family train attempted to build their own shelter using Marit's method. They had heard the story, the cart, the moss, the boy who kept his toes, and they had decided it was simple enough to copy. They found a fallen hemlock on the slope below the road, dragged a wagon box beneath it, and packed the gaps with moss. They did not consult Marit. They did not check the trunk supports. They did not sort the moss or dry it. They packed it wet, dark, and heavy, straight from the boggy ground near the creek. The hemlock was rotten. Its support limbs had been dead for years, the wood soft and fibrous, holding shape but not strength. The men did not check for rot because they did not know to check. They saw a fallen tree and a space beneath it, and they filled the space with moss and called it done. Marit heard about the shelter from Anson Pike, who had seen it from the road. He described it in 3 sentences: wrong tree, wrong moss, entrance facing the runoff channel. Marit asked one question. Did they check the supports? Pike shook his head. Marit went to the hemlock. She brought her hand axe and Torbjörn's awl, and a feeling in her chest that was not anger, but something close to it, the weight of seeing a thing she had built with 10 days of labor and a lifetime of inherited knowledge reduced to a careless copy by men who had mocked it 2 weeks earlier. The shelter looked like hers from a distance. Up close, it was wrong in every way that mattered. The moss was dark and sodden, packed into gaps without bark shingles, without drainage, without any attempt to keep it dry. The wagon box rested directly on the ground, with no raised bed beneath it. There was no vent. The entrance faced uphill, directly into the path where snowmelt and rainwater would run in spring, and the hemlock's support limbs, when Marit pressed the awl into them, crumbled. The steel sank into the wood as easily as into wet bread. She told the men. She told them clearly, standing beside the hemlock with the awl in her hand and rot on the steel. The tree was rotten. The supports could fail under snow load, under wind, under their own weight if the wood dried and shrank. The moss was wet and would freeze into a rigid shell that provided no insulation and would not flex if the tree shifted. The entrance would flood. There was no vent. If they slept inside the shelter, they were sleeping inside a trap. The men listened. One of them, the father, nodded slowly and asked what he should do differently. The other 2, his brother and a hired hand, dismissed her. They had seen the cart under the pine. They had built the same thing. The woman was being territorial, they said. She wanted to control the method. She wanted to be the only one who could build under timber. Marit left. She could not force them to abandon the shelter. She could only tell them what she knew. The slide came on a night of rain, not snow this time, a warm front that melted the upper snowpack and sent water streaming down the slope. The saturated ground beneath the hemlock's support limbs gave way. The rotten wood, already soft, split under the trunk's weight. The hemlock rolled 6 inches downhill, not far, but far enough. The wagon box beneath it cracked along its spine. Wet moss, frozen and thawed and frozen again, shattered like clay. The man sleeping closest to the entrance, the hired hand, was pinned beneath the wagon box's broken side rail, his legs trapped, his ribs compressed. Marit heard the shout from the pine. She pulled on her coat and took Torbjörg's awl and the hand axe and went down the slope in the dark. She found the father and the brother digging at the wreckage with their hands. The hired hand was conscious, but could not breathe deeply. The broken rail was pressing against his ribs. The hemlock trunk, shifted on its rotten supports, was bearing down on the wagon box with a weight that 3 men could not lift. Marit did not dig. She studied the wreckage. The trunk had rolled, but not fallen completely. One support limb, thicker than the others, still held. If they could lever the wagon box sideways, out from under the trunk's new resting position, the trapped man could be pulled free. But levering the box meant putting someone close to the trunk while it was unstable, and if the last support gave way, the person doing the levering would be beneath it. She sent the brother for pike. She sent the father to the road camp for rope. She stayed with the hired hand, talking to him, keeping him awake, telling him to breathe in short sips because his ribs could not expand fully. She cleared debris from around his legs, working by feel in the dark, pulling shattered moss and broken planks away from his body. She could feel the tremor in the wagon box each time the trunk settled. The last support limb was holding, but it was not going to hold forever. Pike arrived with 2 loggers and a pry bar. They levered the wagon box while Marit pulled the hired man by his shoulders, dragging him across mud and broken wood until he was clear. His legs were bruised to the bone but not broken. His ribs were cracked. He would live. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who understands that survival is often built in the details no one else respects. Asa Venn appeared at the wreckage the next morning. He had heard the commotion, and he had come not to help but to witness. And what he witnessed gave him exactly what he wanted: a failure. "Your moss nonsense nearly killed a man," he said. He said it loudly, at the road camp, within earshot of the teamsters and the family train and the mother of the boy Marit had saved, stuffing carts under trees, filling walls with swamp trash. This is what happens when a woman who has never built a thing in her life tells men how to build. Marit was standing at the edge of the campfire. She had been up all night. Her hands were cut from pulling broken wood. Her coat was torn at the shoulder. She was 7 months pregnant and exhausted, and she could feel the weight of Asa's accusation settle onto every person listening. She answered by walking to the wreckage. She stood beside the collapsed hemlock, and she pointed. She pointed at the rotten support limb, spongy and crumbling. She pointed at the dark, wet moss, frozen into useless sheets. She pointed at the entrance, facing uphill, already filling with meltwater. She pointed at the spot where a vent should have been and was not. This shelter failed because the tree was rotten, the moss was wet, there was no drainage, and there was no vent, she said. Her voice was steady, and she did not raise it. I told them this before they slept in it. I told them the supports were soft. I told them the moss was wrong. I told them the entrance was facing the water. They did not listen. The method did not fail. The copy failed. And the copy failed because it ignored every rule that makes the method work. She turned to the gathered group. Teamsters, families, pike, roke. the father whose brother and hired hand had been inside the shelter. "The method is not magic," she said. "Wrong trunk, wet moss, no vent, no drainage, unstable supports. Any one of these will kill you. If you cannot tell a sound trunk from a rotten one, do not shelter under timber. If you cannot keep moss dry, do not pack it. If you do not understand why the vent exists, you do not understand enough to sleep inside." Nobody spoke. Asa opened his mouth and closed it. The failure proved Marit's warnings, not his accusations, and every person at the fire knew it. The hired hand had nearly died, not because Marit's method was dangerous, but because 3 men had used it without the knowledge that made it safe. Anson Pike broke the silence. "She told them," he said. He was not speaking to Asa. He was speaking to the camp. "I heard her. She went to the hemlock and she told them the tree was rotten and the moss was wrong. They did not listen." He paused. "She went down the slope in the dark and she pulled Garrett out while the trunk was still moving." "Who else went?" Nobody answered. Nobody else had gone. Merritt walked back to the pine. She climbed the slope in the gray light with her torn coat and her cut hands and her belly heavy with the child who would be born soon in this forest, in this cold, with or without a midwife. She crawled into the pod and lay on the bough bed and checked the charcoal marks against the stones and pressed her hand against the moss wall and felt it hold. The vent breathed. The shelter held. And somewhere in the timber below, Asa Venn stood beside a pile of rotten wood and wet moss, and understood, in the way men understand things they will never admit, that the woman under the pine knew more than he did, and that his knowing this changed nothing about what he would say tomorrow. But the morning after the rescue, something else happened that Asa had not planned for. 3 families asked Marit to inspect their shelters. 2 teamsters brought her cedar bark and asked where to cut vents. Anson Pike carved 4 vent tubes from elder stems and stacked them beside the fire for anyone who needed them. The method was spreading, and it was spreading correctly through Marit's hands, through her teaching, through her refusal to let it be copied badly. The section of road near Barlow Creek was beginning to change, not the road itself. The road was still mud and stumps and misery. But the people on it were beginning to ask a different question. Not how do we get through the timber faster, but how do we survive the timber if we cannot get through it at all? Marit had not set out to answer that question. She had set out to survive one night, but one night had become 10, and 10 had become 30, and the answer she had built under the pine was becoming something larger than one woman's shelter. It was becoming a rule. When you cannot build a house, reduce the world until one body can warm it. The evening after the rescue, Marit went into labor. Not false labor this time, real contractions, regular, building, the kind that begin in the lower back and wrap forward and tighten until breathing is a conscious decision. She was inside the pod. The tallow cup was lit. The vent was clear. The marker pole stood red against the darkening sky. She was alone. Torbjörn was 3 days' ride south, attending another birth. The birthing cord was in Marit's toolkit, coiled beside the awl. The pod was warm and dry and small, and the moss walls held the silence the way they held the warmth, close and steady. Marit pressed her hands against the bough bed and breathed, and felt the child decide that now was the time. Here was the place. And the forest and the snow and the fallen pine and the careful walls of dry moss were enough. The child came in the dark, the way most children come, without regard for readiness, without respect for timing, without the slightest interest in whether the world outside was prepared to receive her. Marit had been through the contractions for 6 hours before she understood that this was not something she could manage alone. The pain had moved from her back to her center, and it came in waves that built higher each time, and between the waves there was a strange glassy clarity in which she could hear every sound the forest made, the vent drawing air, the pine settling above her, the faint drip of melt from a bark shingle outside the entry. In those clear moments she thought about Torbjörn's hands. She thought about her mother's hands. She thought about the way women had been doing this exact thing in exactly this kind of dark, for longer than anyone could count. Then the next wave came, and she stopped thinking about anything except breathing. She had wedged the tallow cup into a crack in the bark wall so it would not tip. She had spread the cleanest cloth she had, a piece of canvas, boiled in the water crock and wrung dry beneath her on the bough bed. She had Torbjörn's birthing cord within reach. She had the draw knife, cleaned for cutting. She had nothing else. No hot water, no second pair of hands. No voice telling her when to push and when to wait. She pushed when her body told her to push. She waited when her body forced her to wait. She gripped the edge of the cart box with both hands and pressed her feet against the moss wall, and the wall held, 8 inches of dry sphagnum compressed against bark. And it held her weight and the force of her body working to bring a life into a space the size of a coffin that had turned out to be the size of the world. Anson Pike was outside. He had come up the slope at dusk because he had heard the sounds. Not screaming, Marit did not scream, but a low continuous sound that carried through the vent and down the slope and told anyone who had ever been near a birth that a birth was happening. Pike crouched beside the entry and did not go in. He kept the entrance clear of drifting snow. He kept the fire burning in the pit outside, not for warmth, the fire could not warm the potty, but for boiling water, because somewhere in the practical depths of his mind, he knew that boiled water was needed, and that he could provide it without entering the space where he was not invited. Gideon Roke came later, carrying a pot from the road camp, already steaming. He set it beside the fire and looked at Pike. "How long?" Roke asked. "Hours," Pike said. They stood in the snow and listened to the sounds from inside the pine, and neither spoke again. The child was born sometime after midnight. Marit felt the final push as a sensation that went beyond pain into something physical and absolute, like a tree falling, like an axle breaking, like the world dividing itself into before and after. And then the weight shifted and the pressure released, and there was a sound, thin, sharp, enormous in the small dark, that was not Marit and was not the forest and was not the wind. Eli Brecka drew her first breath in a moss-walled chamber beneath a fallen western white pine on the south flank of Mount Hood in the winter of 1853. The air she breathed had been warmed by her mother's body and drawn through a vent made of elder stem and bone scrap, angled downward so that ice would not seal it shut. The walls that held the warmth were packed with sphagnum that a woman from Voss had sorted by hand, rejecting every damp clump, testing every dry handful by squeezing it the way her own mother had taught her to squeeze it in a valley 4,000 miles and half a lifetime away. Marit tied the cord with Torbjörn's sinew. She cut it with the draw knife. She cleaned the child with the boiled canvas and held her against her chest and felt the small body seize with cold, and then, slowly, settle into the warmth between them. The tallow cup flickered. The vent drew. The pine above them groaned once, softly, the way old wood groans when the temperature changes, and then was still. Pike heard the cry. He leaned toward the entry flap, but did not open it. "Water," Marit said from inside. Her voice was hoarse and thin and steady. "Warm. Not hot." Pike brought the pot to the entry. He passed it through. His hand brushed the canvas flap, and he felt the warmth inside the pod, a warmth that was startling against the winter air, and for one moment he understood in his body what he had previously understood only in his mind, that the space under the pine was alive, that it held heat the way a hand holds a coal, carefully and with full knowledge of what letting go would mean. Roke said nothing. He stood in the snow with his empty hands and looked at the fallen tree and the mud and bark and moss and the red marker pole against the sky, and he listened to the sound of a newborn child crying beneath 4 feet of snow and a roof that God had built and a woman had furnished. Nobody spoke of coffins now. The days after Eli's birth rearranged the order of things on the road near Barlow Creek. Marit did not leave the pod for 3 days. Pike brought water and food. His own food, not hers, because her flour was running low, and he had supply from the mill camp. He brought broth made from dried meat and salt. He brought a bundle of dry moss he had gathered himself, sorted the way he had watched Marit sort it, the damp rejected, and the dry kept. He left everything at the entry and did not go in. On the 4th day, Marit emerged with Eli bound against her chest in a sling made from Oddman's shirt. The child was small and red, and her eyes were shut against the light. Marit stood in the snow beside the pine and looked at the forest as if seeing it for the first time, not as a threat, but as a place. A specific place where a specific thing had happened that she would carry for the rest of her life. Thomas's mother came up the slope. She brought a knitted cap, sized for an infant, made from wool she had unraveled from a torn stocking. She put it on Eli's head without asking permission, the way women do things for children that do not require permission, and she looked at Marit and said, "She was born in the best-built room on this mountain." Marit almost smiled. It was not a room. It was a cart box stuffed with moss under a dead tree. But Thomas's mother was not wrong. It was the best-built space on the road, and the child born inside it was proof. Torbjörg came back one more time. She arrived on a morning of thin sun, the first sun in weeks, riding her mule slowly through patchy snow. She looked worse than Marit had ever seen her. The ride south had caught her in freezing rain, and she had developed a cough that rattled in her chest like something loose and broken. Her hands, always rough, were swollen at the knuckles. She dismounted stiffly and stood beside the pine and looked at Marit holding Eli and said nothing for a long time. Then she held out her hands and Marit placed the child in them. Torbjörg held Eli the way a midwife holds a baby, with professional certainty, one hand beneath the head, the body resting in the crook of her arm. She checked the child's color, her grip, her breathing. She looked at the cord stump, healing cleanly. She looked at Marit. "You tied it well," she said. "You taught me." "I taught you the knot. You tied it alone in the dark." She handed Eli back. She coughed, and the cough went on too long, and when it stopped, her lips were pale, and her breath was shallow, and Marit could see the cost of 6 winters in the timber written in the lines of Torbjörg's face and the tremor in her hands. They sat beside the fire together for the last time. Torbjörg held her hands toward the heat, and the light played on her fingers, stained with cedar and smoke, scarred across the palms from decades of work, the knuckles swollen and the nails cracked. Hands that had delivered 11 babies in Oregon Territory, hands that had packed moss and stripped bark and cut vents and tested walls and pressed against Marit's cheek once, on a day when the vent was scarred with awl marks and the boy was alive. Torbjörg knew she would not survive another winter in the timber. She did not say this. She did not need to. The cough said it. The swollen hand said it. The slow way she mounted and dismounted said it. She was 58 years old, and the mountains had taken what they were going to take, and the rest was borrowed. "You know enough now to teach," Torbjörg said, "but teach carefully. A person who copies without understanding is more dangerous than a person who does nothing." "I know," Marit said. "I saw the hemlock." Torbjörg nodded. She looked at the pine one last time, at the moss walls, the bark shingles, the double vent, the drainage trench, the marker pole. She had helped build it. Her knowledge lived in its walls. Her voice lived in its proportions. And now her student would carry it forward, and the student's student would carry it further, and somewhere down the chain, the original hands would be forgotten, but the principle would remain. Dry moss, raised bed, shed water, clear vent. She mounted her mule. She rode down the slope. Marit watched her go and held Eli against her chest and did not call out because there was nothing to call out that the silence between them had not already said. Torbjörg Kvama died the following spring at the pack station near Summit Meadows, attended by the family she had lived with for 6 years. She was buried on a slope overlooking the road she had traveled more times than she could count. Marit did not learn of her death until weeks later, when a teamster brought the news along with a small bundle, Torbjörg's wool coat, patched at both elbows, folded around a whittled bone needle, and a note in a hand that was not Torbjörg's, because Torbjörg had not written in English, only spoken it. The note said, "For the woman at the pine. She will know what it means." Marit held the coat. She pressed it against her face and breathed in the smell of smoke and cedar and wool and cold air and the particular scent that belonged to no one else and would never exist again. Then she folded it and placed it inside the pod, on the bough bed, where it would stay dry. By the time the snow melted and the road opened fully in the spring of 1854, 3 emergency shelters existed along the roughest stretch of the Barlow Road near the creek. The first was the original, the cart box beneath the fallen pine, improved and reinforced, with double vents and drainage and a marker pole. The second was built under a rock shelf 200 yards east by Anson Pike and a teamster named Collis, following Marit's specifications exactly. Raised bed, dry moss, bark shingles, angled vent, entrance facing away from runoff. The third was beside a massive root plate from a windfall cedar, reinforced with split shakes that Pike had carried from the mill. Marit marked each shelter with a carved pine sign, a simple symbol showing a vent angle and 3 words cut into the wood. Dry moss only. She inspected each shelter herself. She tested the supports, the moss, the vents, the drainage. She rejected 2 proposed sites, one because the tree was not sound, one because the ground sloped toward the shelter instead of away from it. She did not apologize for the rejections. She explained them, and the explanations were specific. This limb has rot. This soil is clay and will not drain. This trunk is too narrow and will not carry snow load. The men who had proposed the sites listened because the hemlock failure was still fresh, and the hired hands' cracked ribs were still healing. Teaching became a daily rhythm. Families passing through on the road stopped at the pine and asked questions. How dry must the moss be? Marit made them squeeze it. How thick must the walls be? She held up her hand, thumb to little finger, and said, "This much on the wind side, half on the sheltered side. How do you know the tree is sound?" She gave them the awl, pressed the steel into the support limbs. If it sinks past the tip without resistance, the wood is rotten. Walk away. She taught children to gather moss from raised logs and stone walls, never from standing bogs. She taught women to lay bark shingles from top to bottom, overlapping like fish scales, so water ran outward and never inward. She taught men to cut vents and angle them downward and test them with smoke. She did not lecture. She demonstrated. She put the materials in people's hands and let their hands learn. Anson Pike became her most consistent collaborator. He carved vent tubes from elder stems and stacked them beside the road campfire, free for anyone. He split shake boards and delivered them to shelter sites. He learned to sort moss by feel, and he taught others to sort it. and when he taught them, he said the same thing Marit had said to him. Squeeze it. If your hand stays dry, it is ready. If your hand is wet, put it back. He did not announce a courtship. He arrived. He worked. He carried bark and moss and split shakes, and he asked questions and he listened to the answers, and he came back the next day and the next. He repaired the broken cart frame, the same frame that had snapped its axle pin on the descent near Barlow Creek, and rebuilt it as a sled for hauling materials. He brought it to Marit without ceremony and said it was better as a sled than it had been as a cart, and Marit looked at the sled and at Pike and at the careful joinery he had used to reinforce the frame, and she said, "The joints are good." "They are," Pike said. That was the beginning, not a declaration, not a gesture, a shared recognition that the work was better with two people and that the two people were these two people here beside this tree in this forest that had tried to kill them both and failed. Months passed, the road dried, trains came through in greater numbers as the season opened. Marit answered questions and inspected sites and refused to let anyone build under a tree she had not checked. Her authority was not formal. Nobody appointed her. Nobody gave her a title. It was the authority of a person who had survived a thing that everyone could see and who could explain why she had survived it in terms that anyone could follow. Gideon Roke brought a young wagon captain to the fallen pine in midsummer. The captain was new to the road, confident in the way young men are confident before the mountain has corrected them. Roke walked him around the shelter and showed him the walls, the vents, the drainage, the charcoal marks still aligned with the stones below. The captain looked at it and said it was clever for a woman's work. Roke did not respond to the comment. He stood beside the pine and looked at the captain with the patience of a man who has learned something at great cost and is about to spend a small portion of what he learned. "Before you tell a person what cannot be done," Roke said, "look at what they are measuring." The captain did not understand. He would, eventually. The mountain would teach him the way it taught everyone. But for now, Roke's words hung in the air beside the pine, and Marit, who was packing moss into a new section of wall 20 feet away, heard them and said nothing. Asa Ven's final reckoning did not come with drama. It came with flour. In late spring, when the road was passable and supply trains were running, a family fell ill from meal they had bought from Asa at the road camp. The flour had been stored damp, sold as sound, and it had turned. The family and a man, his wife, and 2 children developed cramps and fever that lasted 4 days. The children recovered first. The wife recovered slowly. The man, who had eaten the most because he had rationed the children's portions and taken the remainder himself, did not fully recover for 2 weeks. Gideon Roke investigated because the Territorial Road Company took supply fraud seriously. Bad provisions on the Barlow Road could kill people, and dead emigrants were bad for the road's reputation and worse for its funding. Roke found 3 other families who had purchased flour from Asa that same month. 2 reported spoilage. 1 had fed the flour to livestock, and the animal had refused it. Roke forced Asa to refund every purchase. The refund cleaned out most of Asa's trading capital. His mule string, already reduced by the storm, now carried goods he could not sell to people who would not buy from him. His reputation on the road was not destroyed. It had never been good, but it was now specifically bad in a way that attached to his name and followed him from camp to camp. Asa's acknowledgement of Marit came not as words but as action, and it came during the last storm of the season, a late squall in April that caught the road camps by surprise and dumped wet snow on shelters and tarps and wagons that had already been packed for the dry season. Asa brought his remaining trade goods, 2 sacks of beans, a bundle of cured hides, a crate of iron fittings, to the drainage shelter beneath the rock shelf. He stood outside the entrance and looked at the bark sign with its vent symbol in its 3 carved words. Then he looked at Marit, who happened to be checking the shelter's moss walls after the first snowfall. "Where do I stack them?" he asked. "Not against the moss," Marit said. He stacked them on the raised bark platform, away from the walls, where they would stay dry. He did not thank her. He did not apologize. He did not admit that his flower had rotted while hers had survived, or that his mockery had been wrong, or that the coffin he had predicted had turned out to be a cradle and a school and a place where a boy kept his toes and a woman gave birth, and a method was born that would outlast every sack of flour he had ever traded. He stacked his goods, and he left, and that was his conversion, practical submission to a method he could not deny and a woman he would never praise. Marit watched him go. She did not feel triumph. She felt the particular exhaustion of being right for a very long time in the company of people who needed you to be wrong. Marit Brecka and Anson Pike married in the spring of 1856 in a small ceremony at a settlement near the base of the mountain. Pike had asked her in the autumn of 1855, standing beside the fallen pine on a day when the first frost had turned the bark shingles silver. He did not ask whether she would have him. He asked whether she would let him build a cabin beside the pine, not over it. She said only if the roof pitch was right. He built the cabin. The roof pitch was right. It was a small structure, 1 room, a stone hearth, a sleeping loft, but it was built by a man who had spent a year learning how wood and air and water interacted from a woman who had learned it from a midwife who had learned it from a mountain. The walls were chinked with dry moss. The vents were angled downward. The drainage ran away from the foundation. Everything Pike built after the winter of 1853 carried the mark of what he had learned beside the fallen tree. They raised Eli in the cabin. 2 more children followed. A boy they named Oddmund for the father who had died near the Snake River, and a girl they named Torbjörg for the woman who had taught Marit to tell the difference between knowledge and luck. The way station grew slowly. Pike built a drying shed where travelers could hang wet bedding over a low fire. Marit kept a store of dry moss and bark shingles available for anyone who needed emergency shelter materials. They charged nothing for the knowledge. They charged a small fee for the use of the drying shed, enough to keep the operation running, not enough to make it a business. The distinction mattered to Marit. What she had learned under the pine was not a product. It was a survival rule, and survival rules belonged to anyone who needed them. Wagon captains began asking about shelter sites before they asked about grazing. The question on the road changed from, how fast can we get through, to what do we do if we cannot get through? It was a small shift, but it saved lives. Families who arrived at the rough stretch of the Barlow Road in late season no longer faced the binary choice between pushing forward into danger or sitting down to die. They had a third option: reduce the space, insulate the walls, clear the vent, and wait. The fallen pine stood for another 12 years before the support limbs finally gave way and the trunk settled to the ground. By then, the original shelter had been rebuilt twice, once after a heavy snow season cracked the cart box, once after Eli, at age 9, convinced her mother to widen the sleeping chamber by 2 inches so that 2 children could shelter side by side. Marit permitted the modification because Eli had measured correctly and because the child had tested the moss by squeezing it, and her hand had stayed dry. When the pine finally settled, Marit stood beside it and placed her hand on the bark the way she had placed her hand on it the first morning, 10 years earlier, when she had knelt in the mud and felt no rain beneath the trunk and thought, small room, dry seams, no wind. The bark was rougher now. Her hand was older. The moss was gone from the walls, cleared out years before when the shelter moved to more permanent sites along the road. But the trunk was still there, and the ground beneath it was still dry, and the 3 stones that Torbjörg had driven into the earth as reference marks were still in place, half buried in soil and needles, keeping a record of a weight that no longer bore down on them. Within 5 seasons of that first winter, travelers on the stretch of the Mount Hood Road near Barlow Creek knew of 3 emergency shelter sites marked by carved pine signs with a vent symbol and 3 words. The method did not replace cabins or proper camps, or the hard wisdom of timing the crossing before the snow. It became something simpler and more lasting, a last resort rule passed from hand to hand along the road. When you cannot build a house, reduce the world until one body can warm it. 19 families used the shelters in the 3 winters following the first. 2 of those families would not have survived without them. Marit Brecke lived out her life near the Barlow Road, known less for one miracle than for refusing to let desperate people copy it carelessly. She taught with her hands, and she tested with the awl, and she rejected wet moss with a squeeze and a flick that her daughter recognized years later as the exact gesture their grandmother had used in a timber farmhouse near Voss. Marit died in 1881 in the cabin Anson had built beside the pine, with Eli holding her hand and the smell of dry moss and cedar smoke in the walls. Asa Venn had said, "By first snow, that pine will have 2 graves under it." But when the blizzard came, the pine did not become a grave. It became a roof. The broken cart did not hide supplies. It held breath, warmth, a frightened boy, an unborn child, and a woman everyone had already counted out. And on a spring morning years later, with meltwater dripping from the bark of the great pine and the road below turning from white to brown to green, Marit Brecke knelt beside someone else's shelter and pressed dry moss into a seam with hands that knew exactly how much pressure the wall required. Not because the forest had been kind, but because she had learned exactly where its strength was hiding